When we think of an ocean, we usually think of it as this massive barrier, right? Something that separates continents. But what if I told you that for centuries, the Indian Ocean wasn't a barrier at all? It was actually a highway, a bustling, ancient superhighway of exchange, long, long before we ever had a word like globalization.
So let's just dive right in. Between the years 1200 and 1450, trade in the Indian Ocean didn't just pick up, it absolutely exploded. So the big question we're tackling here is, why? What was it that drove this incredible boom? What were the key ingredients that turned these waters into the absolute center of the world's economy?
Okay, so to really get a grip on this boom, we first have to understand a huge shift that was happening at the time. We're talking about a massive pivot away from the old traditional land routes and out onto the open ocean.
Right, so a huge piece of the puzzle is what was happening on land. For a long time, the massive Mongol Empire had kept the famous Silk Roads pretty safe for merchants. But now, that empire was starting to break apart, and that meant overland travel was becoming way more dangerous, way less reliable. This created what you might call a powerful push factor. Merchants were literally being pushed off the land and towards the sea, which was suddenly looking like a much safer, much more stable bet.
But see, it wasn't just about running away from problems on land. There were also these incredibly powerful pull factors, drawing traders out to sea. We're talking about a whole wave of new financial tools, amazing new technologies, and a deep, deep understanding of the environment that made sea trade more attractive than it had ever been before.
First up, let's talk about the money. Commerce was getting a serious upgrade. I mean, just moving away from simple bartering to using currency more was a big deal. But the real game changers were these new financial tools. Things like systems of credit and bills of exchange. You can almost think of them as a 13th century version of an international wire transfer. They basically oiled the wheels of commerce, making these huge long-distance deals so much smoother and easier to pull off.
And then there was the tech, which was solving some of the biggest problems of sea travel. Once the magnetic compass became more common, it completely changed the game. For the first time ever, sailors had a reliable answer to that terrifying question, which way am I going? Even when they were totally out of sight of land.
And you pair that compass with the astrolabe. This incredibly clever device let a sailor figure out their latitude just by measuring the position of the stars. So now you could answer the other critical question, okay, but where am I right now? All of a sudden, plotting your position in the middle of a vast ocean wasn't guesswork anymore, it was becoming a science.
And you can't forget the sail itself. The triangular lateen sail was a massive breakthrough because it let ships sail against the wind. I mean, think about that. That is huge. It basically solved the age-old problem of being completely at the mercy of the weather. It meant less time just sitting around waiting for the perfect wind, which made journeys faster, more predictable, and it opened up a whole bunch of new routes.
But the technology wasn't just about man-made gadgets. The most critical knowledge of all was understanding the environment itself. These mariners had such a deep, sophisticated knowledge of the monsoon winds. These were predictable, seasonal winds that they could use to schedule their voyages so perfectly, it was really like they were riding on a natural clockwork highway system.
And of course, you needed the right ships for the job, and shipbuilding technology was advancing like crazy. You had these colossal Chinese junks, which were basically floating warehouses, capable of carrying just staggering amounts of cargo. And at the same time, the classic Arab dhows were getting bigger and better, with larger hulls that made them perfect for these long, ambitious ocean journeys. Now, beyond all the tech, there was this powerful cultural force at work too, the spread of Islam. You see, the faith has a historically positive view of commerce, and that created a kind of common ground. It was a shared network of trust, of shared values, even shared legal ideas that just made it that much easier for a merchant from Persia to do business with someone from East Africa.
So you've got all these different engines of expansion firing at once, and the result? The world was being fundamentally reshaped. So let's take a look at the incredible, transformative effects of all this new trade.
Well, one of the most obvious results was the rise of these incredibly wealthy and powerful states that just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Along the Swahili coast, cities became the gateway to all the riches of Africa's interior. In Southeast Asia, the Sultanate of Malacca controlled a critical choke point and got rich simply by taxing every ship that sailed through. And in India, Gujarat's perfect position made it a central hub for things like textiles. The pattern is so clear, and it's one we still see today. If you control the trade, you control the wealth.
So what exactly were they trading? Well, sure, you had the fancy luxury goods like spices and gems, kind of like the old Silk Road. But the Indian Ocean network was different because ships could handle bulk.
We're talking massive quantities of cotton, timber, grain, and sugar crisscrossing the sea. This wasn't just trade for the ultra-rich anymore. This was trade in everyday essentials, and it was reshaping economies and even what people ate across entire continents.
And all of this movement of people led to a really interesting social change, the growth of what we call diaspora communities. Basically, these are groups of traders and their families who would settle far, far from home, but they'd keep these really strong cultural and business links back to where they came from.
These communities ended up playing such a crucial role. They were like the connective tissue holding the whole network together. I mean, think about it. An Arab merchant living on the Swahili coast understood both cultures. They became these vital brokers who could bridge the gaps, smoothing out the friction of international trade. It's not so different from how global consultants or multicultural communities work in our own cities today.
But here's the thing. You could argue that the most important things being exchanged weren't physical goods at all. It was the movement of ideas, of religions, of languages, and critically, of technology. This incredible cross-pollination of cultures would have the most lasting impact of all, creating a truly interconnected world.
And if you want the perfect example of this, almost the grand finale of this whole era, you have to look at the legendary voyages of the Chinese admiral Zheng He. In the early 1400s, the Ming Emperor sent out these enormous treasure fleets. And their mission wasn't just about trade. It was about diplomacy, about projecting Chinese power and influence across the entire ocean.
The scale of these expeditions is, well, it's just hard to wrap your head around. On his very first voyage alone, Zheng He was in command of a fleet of over 300 ships. That's a naval force way larger than anything European powers could even dream of at the time.
And the crew needed to staff all those ships? We're talking more than 27,000 people. Sailors, soldiers, diplomats, you name it. It wasn't really a fleet. It was more like a floating city, a completely unprecedented show of maritime power for the 15th century.
And these voyages weren't just for show. Zheng He's state-of-the-art ships carried advanced Chinese technologies with them, most famously gunpowder weapons. These expeditions played a huge role in spreading that transformative military technology all throughout the Indian Ocean world.
So, when you start to put all these pieces together, you really begin to see why historians sometimes call this whole era globalization's first draft. It was a complex, deeply interconnected world that, honestly, looks surprisingly familiar.
So, to quickly recap the recipe here, this trade boom wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect, potent mix. A push away from the failing land routes, a powerful pull from new sea technologies and financial tools, the absolutely essential knowledge of the monsoon winds, and finally, those human networks of trust and culture that tied the whole thing together.
Which really leaves us with one last thought to ponder. We're talking about a world connected by sea lanes, shared knowledge, and cultural exchange hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So how did this ancient web, this first draft of globalization, set the stage and lay the groundwork for the even bigger global connections that were still to come, and for the hyper-connected world that we all live in today?